Hi, TheHande here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about video game spiritual sequels or spiritual successors. Now, what a spiritual sequel or successor is can mean different things depending on the context. But in the video game space, what is traditionally meant by a spiritual successor is a game that is intentionally meant to follow the style of a prior game or game series, but which is not officially a part of that series for whatever reason, either because the original game didn't really lend itself to a sequel, or in more common cases because the rights to that video game are actually owned by a big company and the developers don't have the ability to acquire the original license. And even within that group, there's quite a bit disparity. For instance, there's a lot of fan-developed sequels and successors that may or may not become official at some point. But in today's video, specifically, I wanted to talk about spiritual sequels to video games that were developed by the original creators of those video games, but who no longer had access to the original intellectual property or series that they wanted to develop the game for. The games today that I'll be talking about are Bullfrog's Theme Hospital, Rareware's Banjo-Kazooie, and then of course the two game series which I always make random videos about on this channel, Castlevania and Mega Man. Now, the reasons why people make these spiritual sequel games is obviously that there often is an already built-in follow-up for the original game, but because the game industry, for instance, doesn't maybe value that type of game anymore, bigger game development studios may not have the incentive to actually develop those games, and this is why those franchises often end up kind of dying out. But it should also be pointed out that making that kind of spiritual successor, or indeed even revitalizing an old game series, is never a surefire recipe for success. Attempts of, for instance, remaking or re-envisioning certain old games that have, for instance, failed in the marketplace. And one core factor might be, for instance, that the audience for these kinds of games isn't necessarily as big as the developers originally imagined. These kinds of games, after all, are being really developed for the hardcore following of the original game, whatever it was. So today's video is basically structured in a way where I will go from the most successful spiritual successors to the least successful. And let's start with the first one of these, which is the spiritual successor to Theme Hospital. Now, this is kind of an interesting one because Theme Hospital was technically a spin-off of another Bullfrog title, Theme Park, which I would argue is probably one of that company's most successful titles. Not only did Theme Park have a bunch of sequels and spin-offs, but indeed some of them weren't even theme park related, such as Theme Hospital. And it's kind of weird, Theme Hospital was not like a massive title, but it was big enough that Bullfrog did indeed port it to multiple systems. Now, all of Bullfrog's titles these days belong to Electronic Arts, and as a result, there was really no chance for the original developers to ever get their hands on the Theme title. So what they instead did was develop a spiritual successor in the point of Two Point Hospital, which first released for PCs in 2018, and then gradually for other systems over the next couple of years. Sorry for the jarring jump cut. I was also supposed to mention that the developers originally were going to use Kickstarter money to make this, but then decided against it because Kickstarter-based game development had really kind of stopped being a thing by this point. I'm only putting this in here because I'm going to be talking about Kickstarters a lot with all the other entries. And 2 Point has been by far one of the most successful spiritual successor titles ever made. 2 Point Software made a distribution deal with Sega, who then partly helped with the support of the game. And subsequently, there have been two sequels to the game, 2 Point Campus in 2022, and then 2 Point Museum this year in 2025. And I think a big reason for why 2 Point Hospital has to be this successful is that there clearly seems to be an appetite for these very slow-paced management-style titles in today's gaming community, because, you know, these games aren't like super showy AAA dealios or anything. And the fact that the follow-up series has now actually vastly outgrown the original. I mean, again, Theme Hospital was only one game, they never even made a sequel for it. It's actually pretty impressive in its own right. The second most successful of the spiritual successor titles that I'm going to talk about today is the Bloodstained series, which is the spiritual successor to Castlevania. Now, this title was developed using Kickstarter money, and it involves an old friend of ours, Konami producer Koji Igarashi. After Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 unfortunately underperformed, the Castlevania franchise was basically put on permanent hold. And yes, I realized the last time I talked about the Castlevania series, I kept getting the name of that game wrong. Igarashi teamed up with Inti Creates, who will also come up with another game that I'm going to talk about, and finally managed to release Bloodstained in 2018. The first game was made in this kind of neo-retro style, with callbacks to various older Castlevania titles, and it ended up becoming successful enough with 2 sequels that would follow, though these were actually made with modern graphics. I think Igarashi was really on point with this one, just noticing that old school Castlevania fans really wanted something kind of traditional, with Lords of Shadow having been a rather dramatic change of direction for the entire series. However, I don't know what the current state of affairs with Bloodstained is. The last game in the series came out in 2020 and we really haven't heard anything else from them. Next up on our list is the spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie, Yooka-Laylee. So, those of you who don't know, Banjo-Kazooie, of course, is one of the cornerstone titles of the 3D platformer genre, having come out originally on the Nintendo 64 in 1998. This game is widely credited for having kind of formalized a lot of the conventions of 3D platformers, which really had their heyday in the late 90s and then the early 2000s. Banjo-Kazooie then had a sequel very late on the N64 called Banjo-Tooie, but then the series went dormant for almost a decade after Rare was bought out by Microsoft. Now Banjo, unlike Rare's other big series, Donkey Kong, was owned by them. So after a few years of not such huge success on the Xbox platform, Rareware decided that it was time to bring back Banjo-Kazooie in the form of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. However, this game is kind of notorious now because it rather dramatically changed direction from the 3D platformer style, with putting a much heavier emphasis on vehicles and level exploration through them. This decision, although very unpopular, was actually justified by the Rareware developers because they were worried that the classic 3D platformer was just not in vogue. And to give them a little bit of credit, they were not completely wrong. 3D platformers had more or less just disappeared from the gaming limelight by this point. This decision does seem a little bit ironic considering what would happen a few years afterwards. Nuts and Bolts was a notorious dud that is considered to have officially kind of killed off the Banjo series. And after a few years, Rareware developers finally began leaving Microsoft as they were becoming increasingly unhappy with the types of games that they were working on. In the mid-2010s, they started off their own Kickstarter in order to release a traditional 3D platformer which would be called Yooka-Laylee, which officially finally came out in 2017. Now, Yooka-Laylee was not an all-out failure, but it wasn't maybe as big of a hit as the developers Playtonic originally really intended it. Now, it was a 3D platformer with a heavy emphasis on level exploration with gigantic worlds in the style of the original Banjo titles, and this is actually something that it kinda got heavily criticized for, with many citing that the design of the game seemed horribly out of date when compared to how games were right now. So Yooka-Laylee simultaneously kind of succeeded and failed in the sense that it succeeded in following upon the design principles of the original Banjo titles, but it then kind of failed to resonate with modern gamers in the way that Playtonic maybe originally hoped. Now, like I said, the game wasn't an all-out flop, it actually did make some money, and there was a spin-off title released of it 2 years later, which was a 2.5D platformer. However, we really haven't heard anything since from the Yooka-Laylee people, so it's fair to say that Yooka-Laylee wasn't an all-out success either. Alright, and then we finally come to the spiritual successor to Mega Man, which means I'm going to have to talk about Mighty Number 9. Back during the very start of the 2010s, 2012 to be precise, Capcom went through something that I affectionately refer to as the Big Mega Man Purge. Following Mega Man 10, Capcom was developing 2 different Mega Man titles, and the big one that a lot of people might remember is Mega Man Legends 3. But they were using this weird website to gauge engagement with their fans, and when the engagement inevitably dropped, they deadass canceled the game. This was honestly a little bit depressing for Mega Man's creator Keiji Inafune, who then went on to leave Capcom and start his own company, Concept. Look, I love Keiji Inafune, but even I'll admit that he's not extremely creative with the titles of his company. However, in 2013, he did then start a Kickstarter to create his spiritual successor to Mega Man Mighty Number 9. Now, this was around the time when old game designers putting out Kickstarters to make new games was just starting to become a big thing, and as a result, Inafune actually reached his Kickstarter goals quite effectively. He also teamed up with Indie Creates, whom I mentioned previously had worked on Bloodstained, and they had also worked on the last two Mega Man games. And if Inafune had only just, used the Kickstarter to get Mighty Number 9 released, initially on PCs and then maybe later ported it over to other consoles, I think we would now remember it a little bit more fondly than we do now, because what instead ended up happening was that Inafune was caught in a bit of a wave of megalomania. Now, I'm an ardent defender of Mighty Number 9 as a game. I genuinely like it. In fact, I would even say that I genuinely like it more than the last three canonical Mega Man games. But unfortunately, Mega Man 9 had a bit of its own mini Duke Nukem Forever situation, meaning that the game was delayed for reasons that really baffle all reason. And on top of that, Inafune committed a few stupid mistakes along the way. So yes, Inafune was able to get enough money to develop Mighty Number 9 from start to finish. And that was all we ever really wanted. We wanted a Mega Man game, and Mighty Number 9 is a perfectly good Mega Man game. However, Inafune had much bigger plans. He actually thought Mighty Number 9 was going to be a launch of a huge media franchise, and as a result, he wanted the game to come out simultaneously on all platforms. All of them. Every single one. Unfortunately, this is not what his Kickstarter was originally really scaled for, which means that the game ended up getting delayed. And then Inafune did another stupid move when he started off another Kickstarter. Effectively, the second Kickstarter, although it was designed to develop another game which was supposed to be a spiritual successor to Mega Man Legends, the one that got canned by Capcom, the idea was basically to siphon off some of the money to help finish up the porting of Mighty Number 9 to other platforms. Unfortunately, this is not how it looked like to everybody outside. I don't care who you are or how much you love Inafune, if a game developer just suddenly starts another Kickstarter when the game from the previous one hasn't even been released, that is gonna look extremely shady. And I think Inafune just genuinely didn't understand what an incredible faux pas this was. The immediate effect of this was that Inafune had to find other ways to finance the development of Mighty Number 9 since the other Kickstarter ended up failing. This pushed the game's release back by a full year. At which point, Inafune at least made one good decision and decided to can the portable ports of Mighty Number 9, but at that point it was too little too late. Mighty Number 9 landed in 2016 with barely anybody paying any attention, and the few outlets that did basically just criticized the game from here to next Tuesday, which again, I thought was completely unwarranted. But yet, Inafune definitely unintentionally sabotaged his own project. Look, I'm saying, it was only meant to be a classic-style Mega Man game anyway. Even in a perfect world where the game would have just come out on PC first and then they would have slowly ported it over to other platforms. I'm not saying Mighty Number 9 would have ever been a massive success, but I do think that we could have maybe gotten at least a couple of sequels out of it, just as with the case of Bloodstained. This also really just badly tainted the reputation of Inafune's own company, Concept. Even though they have managed to release multiple games since Mighty Number 9, none of them have ever had particularly good reception, and Inafune's own reputation, unfortunately, suffered probably the biggest blow overall. So there you go, those were the spiritual successors to a number of video games. Now tell me, what is your favorite spiritual successor to an old game, even if it's not one of the ones that I talked about in this video? Of the ones that I discussed, well, aside Mighty Number 9, I've actually really enjoyed the 2 Point games myself. 2 Point Hospital in particular was my personal favorite. I'm TheHande, see you on the next one.